access it or share with other community groups that may not be able to attend today. Logistics-wise, we're planning to go about an hour, maybe a little bit over, depending on the number of questions we have. And if you do have a question, you'll be able to put it in the box that lists questions. I'll do my best to try to sort through those. At the end of each section, we have 4 sections to go through today. Everyone is on mute except for the presenters and the organizers. And again, time permitting at the end, we'll see what we can do about fielding some questions that we can't get to at the very up front. But I just want to thank everyone again for joining today. My name is Chuck Mills. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Grants at California ReLeaf. I've been managing this grant program for about 8 years now, and we're really excited to have the opportunity to provide additional funding to community groups throughout California to do tree planting and some other green infrastructure using dollars from the California Climate Investments Program. So before we go any further, I want to just give a shout out to my co-hosts and partners today, Green Lining Institute, who'll be talking to you about the social equity and environmental justice components of the grant. Urban Ecos, a firm that resides in Seattle that is going to be doing our GHG calculations for us and for grantees and applicants. And then Cal Government Ops, who has joined us to talk about opportunities to plant on state sites throughout California, both in disadvantaged and underserved areas, low income, and other areas of California. We're not going to spend a lot of time today on the grant application and the guidelines itself. Those have been online now for more than a couple weeks, and there's a lot of material there to look through, and you'll see one of the tips at the end of this slideshow is to read all of that thoroughly. We just want to give you some very quick pointers up front. Again, we have $800,000 for this cycle. The goal is to get it all out in one round to support 10 to 20 projects throughout California. There's a real focus on supporting projects in underserved areas because these funds were allocated in 2016. We'll be using Cal EnviroScreen 3. As those of you, or I'm sorry, Cal EnviroScreen 2, I apologize for that. Cal EnviroScreen 3 is being used for projects that were funded in this past budget, and the subsequent to that, programs like CAL FIRE will be using Cal EnviroScreen 3, which includes references to AB 1550. We're only using Cal EnviroScreen 2, so that'll be just on projects located in DACs per SB 535, and there's more information about that in the index and appendix in the grant guidelines. And then another thing that we'll be stressing throughout this is all projects must contain a significant tree planting component, and we'll talk what about significant means as we continue on. But what are we looking to do today's webinar? A couple of tips about the application guidelines, but mostly grant writing tips, how to do a strong application for this program. I believe the minimum application is $10,000 or $20,000. The maximum is $75,000. So it's a pretty broad swath of what community groups, what they might have capacity for, and how they could write a better grant. We're going to spend some time talking about how you measure a project's GHG reductions. Again, we'll be doing that for grantees, but there's information that applicants need to provide to us in order to accomplish that. And then there's a couple new wrinkles that we put into this cycle of the Social Equity Grant Program that we'll be going over throughout the webinar today as well. And then an overarching theme that I think is important to all the participants on this webinar is authentically connecting to your community, and that will be addressed later on. And finally, as I said, we'll have opportunities for Q&A at the end of each section. And this is the first of 4 sections. A few plugs that are not completely relevant to what we'll be discussing today, but that I want to put on here just to get on your radar screen if you are interested in urban forestry. The biggest is that in this past fiscal year budget for 17-18, CAL FIRE was awarded a record amount of dollars from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for urban forestry grants. They have released their call for proposals as well. They're due February 26th, a couple days before us. And those awards start at $150,000 and go up to $1.5 million, depending on the program size. what we try to do with our program is fill the gap that can't be filled by CAL FIRE, and that is for those smaller community groups that don't have the capacity or maybe don't have a project large enough to hit that minimum gap of 150,000 or that minimum award size of 150,000. That's what our program is for. It largely mirrors the CAL FIRE program, but we have put in a few things to make it easier for community groups to access these funds and work with us. But I want to bring this program to your attention, and especially this tip at the bottom. There are no restrictions on applying to both programs. The CAL FIRE program was funded out of fiscal year 17-18 dollars. Ours was funded out of fiscal year 16-17. So while you can't apply to our program if you received a CAL FIRE grant in 2017 for forest improvement, you can apply for a new CAL FIRE grant, and their program is running concurrently with ours. So bringing that to your attention. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is that we're going to be doing some deep community outreach workshops on this program starting next week throughout California, focused primarily on underserved areas in Southern California, the Central Valley, and the Bay Area. Strongly encourage you to attend if there's unanswered questions that you come from today's webinar, or if you just want to learn more about what's happening in the specific areas of the state as it relates to this program. CAL FIRE Regional Urban Foresters will be present, and if you have any questions, you're certainly free to call me. Finally, for those of you that are really interested in urban forestry and want to know more about what's happening in the community beyond what we're discussing today in the grant program, we do have a retreat that we do every year. This year it happens to be in Sacramento, early days of May. We encourage you all to participate, and again, you can contact myself or other members of California Relief staff if you'd like more information. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on eligibility just for some purposes of clarity, and then trees before going on to other panelists. Eligible projects. The CAL FIRE grant as it is written and what we need to abide by is that the projects need to focus first and foremost on tree planting. The overall mission of the program is to reduce greenhouse gases. The funds that are being provided for the program are from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, also known as the California Climate Investments Program. And the trees, starting early on and then up through maturity, those are the ones that are going to give us the biggest bang for buck in terms of carbon sink and carbon sequestration. With that said, there is a little bit of wiggle room in our application to do other green infrastructure that could be complementary to the overall objective of planting large GHG reducing trees. And here are some examples that we funded in the past. Room for a small community garden. Fruit trees mixed with significant shade trees that are going to reduce GHGs are also acceptable. Bioswales, it would have to be a pretty small bioswale given the amount of funding we have available in each grant up to the maximum of 75,000, but I don't want to rule that out. There are small bioswales that could be complementary, and then I know in certain communities bamboo is a big issue as well. And again, as long as that's a complementary component of the larger grant, we don't want to rule that out. So those are eligible. And I know what some groups have done that we currently are funding is they've looked at a multi-pronged proposal that contains the significant tree planting component, but some of that may be as part of a match to their grant, and that might allow them to use some of their funding for community gardens or a couple of fruit trees that they otherwise might not be able to do. So that's something to consider as a tip if you want to try to incorporate this element into your project. The other thing that I just wanted to talk about, something new that we put into the mix this year, is one of our panelists today, Colleen Ravden, wrote a document for us called the Trees for the 21st Century. And what we tried to do with this document was talk about getting the most out of your tree plantings, what might be some good species to consider without going too far into that. And then also we moved some of the materials that were previously in the application under required resources over to this section. It's really important for you to read this entire document. I believe it's only about 6 pages. There's some great infographics in there. And a tip that comes with this is that after you've read this document and you think you may know what species you want to plant, you can submit your species, your proposed planting palette to us early, and we can give you a sense of what kind of GHG reductions it's going to achieve. And again, we need to thank Kalaine at Urban Ecos for allowing us to be able to provide that service to prospective applicants. You're going to hear this again later in the presentation. We really want to stress that meeting the match requirement can come in a variety of different ways in all sorts of programs. That same holds true for our program as well. However, we really want to ensure that no community group, no matter how small, is discouraged from applying for our grant because of the match requirement. We strongly encourage groups that may not have capacity or funds to do match through either capital outlay or in-kind to use volunteers. Volunteers are a big part of urban forestry anyway. It's the way that we build a sense of ownership for the project. So your volunteer requirement or your match requirement of 25% on this grant can be met entirely by volunteers. California has one of the highest volunteer rates in the nation at $28.46 an hour. So just a few volunteers over the course of several hours each really adds up fast in terms of being able to bring a significant match component to your project. So again, that'll be discussed later on, but I wanted to highlight that now is we do have a match requirement, but we actually encourage folks to do that through volunteers. Couple of quick notes on budgeting. You know, this grant goes longer than some of ours have in the past. We've had grants that have gone as little as 9 months. We're really fortunate in that these funds are available to us for about 2.5 years. We tried to build that into the application. So, you know, these are some tips in terms of how when you're looking at your budget, what you should be looking for. You see here at the end, I've highlighted a couple of things. Be mindful of maximums. That tends to catch folks when they're doing their application, is not looking at the 60% maximum for personnel, or maybe thinking that they can accomplish too much in the period of time that's available to them, and the budget becomes a bit too unwieldy. So just be mindful of the maximums and realistic of what can be accomplished in this 2.5-year time frame. Finally, a couple of tips from me before we get more into the nitty-gritty of the application is read the guidelines in their entirety, and that includes the application, the one-pager, the trees for the 21st century, the appendix, a lot of information that a lot of people have put much time into crafting to make this a very thorough set of guidelines that answer as many questions as possible for the community group applying for the funds. Partnerships are really important, and you're going to hear more about that later. And the big thing, one of the big things that we offer as a service to applicants is, you know, direct access to us. I've already fielded several calls over the last few weeks from groups that are wanting to know specifics about what can and can't be planted, available opportunities to do projects outside underserved areas. We do have funds for that this time. And so I'm generally reachable, and you can just send me an email or call me, and I'll do my best to answer your question. I think that's it. I really want to provide most of the time available to us to the grantee or to the other panelists. At this point, I don't see any questions that have come in thus far, so we will be able to, however, I just see a question. So let me see what the question is. So far, I just have something that says I do have a question. Let me see if I can the funds be used to maintain existing trees? So that is a yes and no question. The funds can be used to maintain the trees that you're planting with this project. So if you get a grant and you immediately want to do all your tree planting up front, and you want to budget personnel and equipment, water, whatever it might be, irrigation, over the course of the next 2 years to maintain those trees, that's absolutely fine. In terms of being able to apply for a project where you're just maintaining other trees, we are not at that point yet. It is something that we've talked about with several of our partners in the environmental justice community, and also with CAL FIRE and the Air Resources Board. At this point, they're not ready to take that leap of faith that maintaining our existing green trees is a viable use of the greenhouse gas reduction funds. As an advocate, we are working to make that happen. And with some of the laws that were passed last year directly relating to urban forestry and the extension of cap and trade, we may see some movement of that over the next couple years. But for right now, we're just planting trees in this project and those trees can be maintained through the full cycle of the grant. And then they have to be maintained an additional 3 years thereafter, and that's very evident in the guidelines and the application. So thank you for the question. That appears to be the only question I received, which is great because I want to, oh, I'm sorry, there's another one. How do we show indirect and direct admin costs, and what is the cap on the indirect rate? The cap is 10%, and for indirect costs, you don't have to show anything. That's something that I have to give CAL FIRE credit for. They have said that is something that they're not demanding of applicants this time, so you can just do up to 10% for indirect costs. We won't ask you for receipts on that. For direct admin costs, we will ask you for receipts, and that could be for liability insurance for the project, mileage related directly to the project, a cell phone for someone that has been hired exclusively for this project. Those are some examples of some direct admin costs where you will need to do receipts for it, but we do have a 10% cap on indirect costs. Thank you for the question. Can we use the funds to purchase replacement trees? Yes, you can. That is mentioned in the application. Replacement trees are just part of the process. We don't have an expectation that every tree will do fantastic right out of the gate. Obviously, it's fine if it's great if they do. But yes, we do allow room for you to have a window to do replacement trees. We just ask that you not buy them and store them. Make sure that when you're buying them, they're actually going to go into the ground. Okay, another question. Wow, they're really coming in now. Please explain replacements of tree eligibility. Please explain replacements or tree eligibility. I think I may have just covered that question. The tree eligibility is very much covered in the book Trees for the 21st Century, and replacement trees should be for those that have shown either through lack of water or pest disease or vandalism that they're clearly not going to make it. Then you could put in the species to do that. Again, you just have to make sure you're maintaining that for 3 years after the application ends, but you can maintain it with funds from the grant while the tree's planted. Okay, another question. In the match, can we include kids and teenagers that volunteer for your project? Absolutely. That's not a problem at all. So many of the volunteers that come out for projects are from schools. There's a lot of folks throughout the state that work exclusively with schools, either to plant fruit trees or provide shade on campus. Tends to be very popular with the kids, gives them the sense of ownership of that green infrastructure, and yeah, absolutely, it's very much encouraged. Okay, wow, looks like I made it. So at this point, I'm going to advance, I'm going to give control over to a colleague, Colleen Ravden, who's going to take us through some real nuts and bolts on the grant as it relates, or on the project as it relates to GHG reductions. So Colleen, I believe you have control if you want to see if you can advance the slide.
Okay, I'm going to, let's see if I got what I need here. Never works right the first time. Chuck, we practiced this and it's not.
Okay.
Not going. Let's try one more time. Oh, there we go. All right, let's see how this works. And if I need you, Chuck, to advance my slides for me, then I will just let you know. So okay. Thanks everybody for being here this afternoon, and thanks Chuck for having me. Since Chuck outed me as having left California and moved my family north to Seattle, I just want to reassure you that I have been, the previous years were 15 years or so were spent in California doing urban forestry work, and I have a lot of experience in greenhouse gas calculations and consulting. So you're in good hands, and rest assured that even though I'm a little bit farther north than I used to be when I was in San Francisco, you can reach out to me anytime, and I'm here to help. And that's one of the things I do want to make clear is that I'm going to talk to you about how to maximize greenhouse gases in order to be as competitive as possible in this grant. And you can reach out to me anytime during the proposal period, and I can help you with design ideas for moving the trees in the best ways, choosing species and things like that. So we're here for you to help with all of that. So I'm going to start by focusing really on the greenhouse gases, and then I'm going to quickly at the end cover some of the main points in that document, Planting for the 21st Century, just to highlight some of the issues. But as Chuck said, this is a greenhouse gas reduction grant. It's funded with money from a greenhouse gas fund. And so it is important that the projects that you propose to California ReLeaf, and that California ReLeaf will then report to Cal Fire, meet that objective. And so for some of you, this is going to be a review, but I do see on our list of attendees a bunch of new names. So some of this is a little bit basic, but I want to help people understand how trees reduce greenhouse gases, and therefore how you can get the most out of your project proposal as possible. So we're going to start with the planning side of things. How do trees reduce greenhouse gases, and how can we use what we learn there to maximize and design the best project that we can? Let's see here. Hang on one second. I'm trying to move forward, but doesn't seem to want to go. Chuck, do you want to take back control and be my clicker? Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Okay, so click me one forward, please.
Okay.
And then we'll talk about the calculating side of things. The first time we did one of these ReLeaf grants, we asked the applicants to do the greenhouse gas calculations to figure out what they projected their benefits to be into the future. And it's very complicated, and there are all kinds of pitfalls. So we decided that the best way to go forward is if we'll do it for you. So I'm going to talk about what I need from you in order to do those calculations myself to save you from having to do them. Okay, so then some grant tips and some design advice, and then finally one more. And then we'll review those guidelines for the 21st century. Okay. So how do trees reduce greenhouse gases? There's two main ways. The first is they sequester it from the air, the atmosphere. So all we mean there is that trees take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the most common greenhouse gas. And they use it to make tree stuff. So they make the trunk and the leaves and the roots and the branches and the flowers and the fruit is all made essentially out of the carbon that's in CO2. So basically this means, Chuck, that the bigger your tree is, the better it is. The more tree stuff it has in it, the more CO2 is pulled out of the atmosphere. And so the tree on the left is a small flowering, it's actually a fruit tree in an orchard. And the tree in the bottom right is an oak, a native oak in Los Angeles. And so that oak tree sequesters about 20 times more greenhouse gases than that little flowering tree on the top. So next. So essentially what that means is in order to accomplish the same amount of greenhouse gas reductions, you need to plant about 20 of those little flowering fruit trees as you would if you planted one oak tree. So it's something to keep in mind. The bigger your tree is, the better. Next. The second way that trees reduce greenhouse gases is that they can help us avoid emissions from reduced energy use. So what we mean there is if we plant a tree to shade a building, the amount of cooling that that tree provides to that building is so substantial that it can reduce the amount of air conditioning that we need to use, which reduces the amount of greenhouse gases produced at the power plant. And this all seems sort of indirect and vague and hard to imagine. But in fact, in many cases, the benefits from reduced energy use are as great or even greater than the amount from sequestration. Now, this is going to be truest in the parts of California where it's very hot, especially hot and dry, which is where when it's hot in California, it's hot and dry. So if you're in the Central Valley, if you're in the Inland Empire, you're going to see really strong numbers from planting trees to reduce energy use. Next. So here are two of those big oak trees. And then next. So two big oak trees planted in open space in a park, in a field, far from buildings, are going to have the same greenhouse gas benefit as one tree planted to shade a building. So next. So what we want to do is focus on the trick to this. So we need to plant our trees to the west, the east, or the south of our buildings, and within 60 feet. Closer is better. So the biggest benefit really comes on the west and the east. Trees planted to the north have no energy conservation benefit from shade. So as much as we can get our trees planted to the west and the east and somewhat to the south of buildings, and within 60 feet closer, accounting for the fact that you can't plant a tree right next to a building for many reasons. As close as we can within reason, the stronger our project is going to, the stronger our greenhouse gas benefits are going to appear. Next. And so one more quick check. What we want to do is move along this spectrum from small trees that aren't shading anything towards the big shade trees close to buildings in residential areas, near institutional buildings, like Matt's going to talk a little bit more about, in business districts. But our goal is to move in this direction from left to right, as it shows in the slide. Next. So, as I said before, please feel free to come to me directly or through Chuck for design advice, because I'm just going to show you here. Chuck, click. We did receive, go back one just for a sec. We received a proposal many rounds ago where this wasn't exactly it, but it was something like this. It was a school with a gigantic sea of asphalt, like you see so often in California, where they'd proposed to plant 2 small flowering trees essentially in the middle of this acres and acres of asphalt. And so we went back to them and said, first of all, these 2 trees are not going to get you very much greenhouse gas benefit because they're very small trees at maturity, and they're going to look really odd sitting in this sea of asphalt. So if small trees are necessary, click, then one thing we could do to make it a little bit better from a design perspective is use them to frame the entrance to that school. So you can't see that. You'll see in a second what that's going to look like. But if we move them at least towards the entrance, they will have some stature. This isn't greenhouse gas benefit, except to the extent that we're getting them closer from a shade perspective. But the small trees still aren't very powerful in that regard. But hey, so first let's move them closer to the building, and then let's make them bigger. Let's make them bigger trees. And hey, wait, we could even go one step farther than that, and we can plant more of them. And so if you click to the next slide, we're going to show you what that looks like. This is a terrible Photoshop job that I did, but I did it really fast just because I think it still makes the point. There's the entrance to the building. There's those 2 tiny trees, what they would look like in the middle of the sea of asphalt. You can barely even see them, okay? There's 2 big trees framing the entrance. Already that makes a much more, from a design perspective, it makes a stronger statement. But from a greenhouse gas perspective, we've already bumped up the value probably by 20 times. Okay. And then there it is with 6 trees. So you really have a completely different experience for the children. You have a much more wonderful shade benefit, and you have greenhouse gas sequestration values that are much, much higher. So we're here to help you with those kinds of that kind of design advice and that kind of species selection, if you would like, and if you get your project together with enough time for us to help look at those kinds of things. Okay, next slide, check. So how do we calculate the benefits? Again, I'm not going to ask you to do that, but I do need some things from you in order to be able to do it myself. And so what we have in your packet is a greenhouse gas reductions worksheet. That's an Excel sheet, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And then ideally, though this isn't necessarily necessary, if possible, a map showing where you want to plant those trees, because again, that's the place where I can help you figure out how to improve it, or it can also give me a chance to figure out, make sure that there weren't any errors in the numbers. And usually those errors have turned out to be, fixing those errors has turned out to really be substantially to the benefit of the applicants. So if you can show me a map of where you think you'll plant the trees, that's also very helpful. Okay, next. So here's the greenhouse gas worksheet that we've included in your packet. We need from you, click, the species, so the scientific name, please, because then I know for sure that we're talking about the same kind of tree. Next. The size of planting, so you can either tell me the actual diameter of the tree, you can tell me the size of the pot that it sits in, so usually we're talking about 15-gallon trees. And those trees are usually about 1.5 inches in diameter when you plant them. So this isn't absolutely critical, but it can be helpful. Next. Then I'm going to talk about this more in the next slide. This is where we figure out those greenhouse gas benefits from shade. So is it a shade tree? And then if you look at the bottom, and there's not a little red box for this, but at the bottom it says shade tree. Is the tree planted within 60 feet to the east, west, south, southeast, or southwest of a building? Yes or no? And then you tell me which direction, and then how far it is. And you don't have to tell me exactly, just 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. And then finally, Chuck, the number of trees. So that's the number of trees that have that set of characteristics, that species, and that are planted in that direction from the building. If you don't know where you're going to plant the trees, and that's often the case, then you can also write me a note and we can talk a little bit about the possibilities. So for instance, if they're going to be trees planted in a residential area, then we can figure out, a lot of times we'll be able to talk through, are they mostly going to be planted on streets that run east-west so that we can see that they're planted to the north and south of buildings or vice versa? Or we can just say, we know we're going to plant them in a residential area and that we're probably going to plant them just randomly on these streets. So therefore, we're just going to say that they're going to be evenly distributed at these cardinal directions. We'll make a good guess at a typical distance and we'll use that. It doesn't need to be specific. It just needs to be, we need to have a good idea. Okay, next. So I want to talk quickly about how we do the shade trees. Quick. Let's say this is this poor school, I'm always picking on it, it's in my old neighborhood, that your vision is to plant the trees like this. So here's what you would tell me first. You're going to count up all the trees and then click. What you have first are 9 trees planted within 20 to 40 feet to the east. Click. 6 trees 40 to 60 feet to the east. 1 tree to the southeast of the building. And 5 non-shade trees. They're too far away to make shade. So this is going to be, you'll have access to this PowerPoint, probably as a PDF. So you can just have a look at this again and figure out how I figured all of that out. But I wanted to give you a general idea of what it would look like. Click. And so this is the sheet that you would turn into me that would, for that particular project that I just showed you. Next. So one thing that we've done differently in this grant application is we've given you a target, and that target is for every $10,000 that you ask for, we're asking you to reduce at least 100 metric tons of greenhouse gases. Now, since I'm going to do the math for you, you aren't going to know exactly what you got until you send it to me and I tell you. So you can do that ahead of time, but also here is our is sort of a spectrum to give you some ideas of what those numbers would look like. So you can look at these species and the numbers attached to them and get a general sense of what your project would look like. The top one is about sequestration. The bottom one is about energy conservation. So just to give you a rough idea, let's say you planted a quercus, an oak. So that's got you on average 4 to 5 tons from sequestration. That's the number on the far right on the top. And you planted it to the east within about 30 feet of the building. And so then that's the second from the right on the bottom row. So that's 4 to 5 tons from sequestration, 2 to 3 tons from energy conservation. Those are some really fabulous numbers. I want to be clear that these are really just averages. The numbers are very different from region to region. I wanted to just give you here a general idea of what you would be looking at. So particularly along the coastal California, the numbers from energy conservation are not going to be very good. That's just something that we have to live with. There aren't that many people with air conditioning. It doesn't get that hot, so the trees aren't really doing that much work. So don't get too attached to these values. They're just to give you some general guidelines. Okay, and I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to run through this part pretty fast. This is just the highlights from Planting for the 21st Century. So that's something for you to take home and read. We tried to make it as easy as possible. It's 6 pages, but it's 6 EG pages. So have a quick look at it. The first 2 are things that I've just talked about. Plant the biggest tree and plant it to shade buildings when possible. Guideline number 3 is about water use. So of course, we're just coming out of a catastrophic drought. We know that this is California, so there's probably another one looming on the horizon. Please choose trees that don't need a lot of water. We give you some resources in that document for where you can get information about that. Number 4, select trees that have shown resiliency to pests and diseases. This is harder because this information changes all the time, but we offer some suggestions about people that you could reach out to in your region because it's also regionally very different to get some information. Number 5, diversify tree selection wherever possible. So I think we have the sense that the climate is going to be changing a lot in the future, but my perspective is we don't really know how it's going to change yet. It's probably going to be hotter, but how much hotter is it going to be? Is it going to be wetter? Is it going to be drier? Is it going to be both of those things in one decade versus the other decade? Since we don't know, I think our best bet is to really make the urban forests of the 21st century as diverse as possible so that we have as much flexibility as we can. So that means within your project, planting more species is better, but it's also valuable to look at what exists in your community and try to go beyond those particular trees whenever you can. And number 6 is avoid invasive species in your region. And again, we give you a document, a website of the California Invasive Plant Council that will help you figure out which trees those are. And that's it for me. Again, one more click, Chuck, and there's my email address. So if you have questions, if you need help with figuring out your species list or design information, then feel free to reach out to me. Phew.
Thank you so much, Kalaine. We're going to see where we are on questions here. I know some more came in.
I can't see them, so you'll have to, I'm not sure why I can't see them, but I can't. So
I will be happy to read them. So let's see. We left off with volunteers. Okay, there's a question about, is the cost of tree removal of diseased trees eligible? The answer to that question is no. That's something that you can provide as match. You can also do the replacement tree for that. So if you're at a park and there's several trees that need to be removed, we are happy to cover the cost for installing those trees and the labor and the trees themselves and the equipment and mulch, etc. But in terms of getting those dead trees out of the park, that's something that you'd want to work with the city on as perhaps a match requirement. Thank you for the question. Question is, part of the project must provide multiple co-benefits such as water quality. Does this grant cover hydration stations, including installation and maintenance at the identified park? That's a really good question. I have not given a ton of thought to that. I would say you probably want to call me for more information on that. My hunch would be that because of the size of the grants, that might be something that would be more appropriate for a higher grant, but that I also don't know what hydration station covers costs are. So we'd be happy to talk through it. Question is, work in a dense area. We'd want to plant trees in the sidewalk medians along busy streets, but we don't have permission of all property owners. Can we submit proposal and design for trees even if we don't have the details completed yet? That's kind of a yes and no. If you're planting street trees, then you're going to need to get permission from the city and or the municipality that you're working with, and you will need to get that ahead of time. If you have the permission from the local government that you're doing the street trees in, and you just don't have the permission of the property owners yet, that is something that you can work on after the fact. We actually have grantees that are doing that right now, but they've already got that step, the most important step of getting permission from the city to first allow for them to go forward. So we do need that ahead of time before we can even consider the grant. But as far as the individuals and the residential property, that can come after. What's the contact information for Kalaine? I believe she just put it up on the last slide, but I can bring it up again. Give me just a second. Or maybe I can't. There we go, Kalaine@urbanecos.com, and I'm happy to leave that up there for a second. And then I think this might be for you, Kalaine. Can you elaborate on within 60 feet of a building? For example, if we're looking at a grant at a local park at an unincorporated community that also has 2 connected community centers, how far would the trees have to be planted? Do you want to take that, Kalaine?
Yeah, so I guess I can expand on that in a couple of ways. First of all, it just has the trees, in order to qualify for it, to achieve shade benefits, the trees need to be within 60 feet of any building. The closer they are to the building, the better the benefit is. So if you have a community center, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to plant a tree around. That sounds like a fabulous place to plant a tree. And so it needs to be within 60 feet. One thing that I didn't say is the trees, let's say you're planting trees along a park and across the street are houses. It's worthwhile to check and see if your trees are within 60 feet of those houses on the other side of the street, because the buildings don't have to be on your property in order for the trees to be shading them. So be sure to look outside the bounds of the property line of where you're planting in order to reap the biggest benefits. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. We're going to move on to another question. Are invasive non-native trees allowed to be funded? Those are two separate questions. Invasives are not allowed to be funded. Non-native trees are allowed to be funded. Non-natives often have stronger survival rates in an urban environment than some native trees. And so, again, in the book that Colleen put together, Trees for the 21st Century, we do speak to eligible trees. I think that's also in the guidelines. So I'd say take a look at that. And you do have to plant trees that are approved by CAL FIRE and also appear in some of the materials in the required resources. So
yeah, so just to be clear, we're not, the definition of invasive lies with Cal IPC, the Invasive Plant Council. So if it's on their list as invasive, it can't be planted. And if it's not, then it can be in theory, unless you have your own qualms, in which case you should certainly feel free to avoid it.
Thank you, Colleen. Will trees and raised planters be counted? It's a really good question. We have funded one project like that before. It was not with greenhouse gas reduction funds. It was in an overpass in San Francisco where someone wanted to do lemon trees and they couldn't go on the ground. I'd be willing to consider it. The review committee would ultimately make that decision. So I wouldn't rule it out. Typically, if they're in containers, they're not going to get the larger GHG bang for buck. Colleen, do you want to speak to this?
My only other concern would be that we need in the presumptions of the calculations and the presumptions of the grant funds are that the trees will live for at least 40 years. And my sense is that trees in containers are just not going to have that same longevity. So I don't think I would necessarily completely rule it out, but I would come at it with a lot of skepticism, I think.
Thanks. Is the 100 metric tons expected over the life of the grant project or the long-term role of the trees? I think that's for you, Colleen.
So when we do the calculations, we're talking about a 40-year projection. So you'll tell us, you tell us what you're planting now, and we'll project those benefits 40 years into the future, and that's where the 100 tons comes in. Otherwise, yeah, the first couple of years of a tree's life have almost no GHG benefits. So we're not gonna hold you to that. We're looking at the big picture. Question
is, do you think planting trees alone will be enough to reach the 100 tons per $10,000? That is a really good question. As you saw in the spectrum that Colleen provided, there are some trees that provide big bang just on their sequestration ability, plus when you add in their savings ability, you could get even stronger numbers. So it really just depends on the project. Again, this is a goal, it's not a requirement, but we need to be able to demonstrate to CAL FIRE that we're meeting our GHG reduction goals that we provided to them when we applied for these funds. Anything to add there, Colleen?
Nope, just the biggest tree possible is really going to be the thing that makes the big difference. And if you're in a hot part of California, if you can plant at least some of the trees to shade buildings, your project will be really strong.
One thing I have noted from a couple of grants we're doing right now is that folks matched their planting project with another planting project where those trees were not being captured either by the local government or state agency or whoever they were working with, and that brought up their numbers considerably, and that allowed them some opportunity to plant some trees that on their own they might not have had the funds or their ability to do in terms of meeting goals. So that's something to consider. Can you use part of the grant money to pay for protectors for the trees from vandalism? And is there any recommendations you have to put on the trees to protect them from vandalism? You can use some of the money to protect the trees from vandalism, grates, etc. Colleen, do you want to offer some suggestions on what are some good protectors?
That is outside of my experience. I think we'd have to come back and.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have too much.
Yeah. I know a lot of people will put some ring fence around the base, especially if they're concerned about kids or small wildlife. The question is, how can we quantify the volunteer hours for the application? In other words, if we need 500 hours worth of volunteers, do we need them to sign up ahead of time? No, you can project. You can absolutely project on your application how many volunteers you'll have on the project. And then we ask for your volunteer sheets if you're awarded the funds as part of your progress reports, just to demonstrate that you are meeting that volunteer requirement. but no, you don't need that commitment from the volunteers ahead of time. Deer cages, yes, that's exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you, Fatima. Someone said deer cages are a good way to protect trees from vandalism with zip ties, so I appreciate that. Okay, we're running a little bit on schedule, but I think we're caught up on questions. Now I'm going to see if I can advance these slides to get to our next presenter. And this is Matt Hennigan with the state of California. And Matt, I'm giving the control over to you right now, so you can let me know if you're good to go.
Yeah, I think I am. Thank you, Chuck.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, thanks again for everyone being here. Excuse me, getting over a little cold. So just to introduce myself and my agency, my name is Matt Hennigan. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Sustainability at the at the Government Operations Agency. And my office is charged with meeting the sustainability goals that were laid out in this Executive Order B1812 that I reference on this slide. And we've also taken on a lot of our adaptation goals under Executive Order B3015. So between the need to save water and the need to adapt to higher temperatures and heat island effect, planting trees on state facilities is absolutely a win-win. But finding funding within existing budgets for re-landscaping facilities and planting trees is a challenge. And that's why I'm looking forward to partnering with you folks and with California ReLeaf to get some of these projects done at state facilities. So the slide here references this guidebook for state agencies. Each agency has actually completed or will soon complete a roadmap for how they are complying with the recommendations in that guidebook. And so the departments are thinking about this stuff, about how, what facilities are vulnerable to high temperatures, how they're going to respond to it. And I think you have, as an applicant with, trees that need to go in the ground, you have a solution to their problem. Chuck, could you advance the slide for me?
Yeah, hang on just a sec, Matt. I got to take control back from you. Okay.
Great. So the opportunity is large, right? We have 1,700 state-owned facilities sprinkled all throughout the state. Obviously, you'll have to think about what is eligible for the grant, right? So planting trees in an existing state park that's out in the woods, that's not urban forestry, right? But we have many, many facilities that are urban, that are in disadvantaged communities that would really benefit. So, we created a map tool with every state-owned facility mapped and listed on some Excel sheets, and those are on the ReLeaf website. I found it pretty easily. And you can waste a lot of time. I'll just warn you, you can spend a lot of time clicking through various state agency buildings and looking for places to plant trees. So I encourage you to do that for your region. You can sort the Excel sheets by the city names that you're interested in, or you can look graphically if you're more interested that way. Make sure you change the base map to a satellite photo so you can really see, rather than just a map, the actual layout of vegetation on the facility. But for example, I've seen employment development offices with huge dead lawns out front that could host a dozen trees easily. And so we'll click through a few examples on the next slides. Each department has its own governance structure. So, sorry, let me go back to that slide just a sec. It can be a little difficult to navigate for an outsider. So that's why I'm here to offer my assistance in connecting you with the right people. So some have very centralized, headquarters dictates everything. But others, it's districts control. So for example, Caltrans, all the decision-making happens at the district office. So getting help navigating those, getting in touch with the right person is a little tough. And so that's why it helps to have, I've got my contact information on the last slide here. Also be conscious of executive branch versus these other branches of government. I have a lot more influence and connections in the executive branch. So UC, CSU, the courthouses, we might have to take a different route to approach them. I just want to paint a picture for you that it's not always, the best approach isn't necessarily to walk up to the front door of the facility you're interested in and knock on it and say, hey, I've got trees to plant. You may want to go through me to get to the sustainability person to get to the right person. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a couple of examples that I pulled off our mapping tool. This is a Caltrans district office in Stockton. It is in a disadvantaged community. And if you look closely, they've got trees, but they've also got a lot of tree wells that don't have trees in them, and a large border that clearly accommodates a couple of trees, but not very many big ones. There's also a kind of a area up front that could host a number of trees. So when you're clicking through, use this as a first pass. And then what I like to do is enter the address into Google Maps and use the street view. And it's almost like you're walking around in front of the facility and you can actually see how wide those median strips are and how many trees they could host. All right, next slide, please. Now, this highway patrol station, we actually walked this site with the Sacramento Tree Foundation because they happen to be working in this area. And we found space for 8 to 10 trees. So, and if you look, there's tree wells with nothing in them. There's this whole front area that has shrubs instead of large trees. The state facilities vary in size, from enormous prisons and state hospitals to small, parking lots. But many, many of them at all different sizes are good candidates for hosting trees. All right, so my last slide, Chuck. I just want to warn you, partnering with state agencies can be complicated. Every agency has their own lawyers. And there are rules about volunteers doing work versus union labor doing work. But this is achievable. We did that project, or we got official approval for that project at the California Highway Patrol as a model to show that this is achievable. So when you're putting your grant applications together, I encourage you to look in your region, see if there are urban sites that are owned by the state where that you can include in your application. I talked to Chuck about this. It's understandable if you don't have a written agreement in place with the state agency by the time you submit your application, but having them on your radar and saying, look, this is an opportunity and we're going to do everything we can to make this happen, I think is enough detail for ReLeaf to evaluate your application. So please take down my my contact information here. Call me, email me. We have a network of, so every state agency that owns facilities is on our sustainable building working group, and they send a person. So I can find that sustainability contact person for you at any state agency, and they can get you to the right person who can either say yes or no to partnering on a tree planting. So this solves a lot of problems for us. I hope it solves problems for you. And thanks again for considering state facilities in your applications. Oh, I'll take questions.
Thanks, Matt, for providing that additional resource for everyone. We have this information up on our website. We have everything Matt talked about, the map, the Excel matrices. So definitely take a look at it. There are hundreds of sites throughout California where you can do this. So I'm going to advance us to questions and answers. And let's see. I'm going to unlock the panel here. Okay. I have a question. Would state park staff time involved in a project be considered match? If the state park staff were involved in a project that was on a state park site, yes, I would imagine that would qualify as appropriate match. We do have some groups in Los Angeles that are working in state parks, and if the state park staff are providing either direct personnel support or are making sure the irrigation is in place or simply overseeing the project as their part of their obligation to the state, absolutely their time can be considered match. And in fact, depending on how they're being utilized, sometimes that kind of time can be considered professional match, which is at the billing rate of the individual rather than just the flat volunteer rate. So if you have the state park staff working solely in a volunteer capacity with all other volunteers to just plant trees, then their time would be counted at the volunteer rate. But if they're explicitly devoting their time to the project in their capacity as a state park employee in filling a specific need for the project, they would actually be able to bill their volunteer time at whatever rate they're paid for that purpose. So good question. Thank you for asking it. That actually seems to catch us up on questions, which is great because we are starting to run out of time. So I'm going to pull us out of questions and answers, and I'm going to get us out of this and take us over to our last presentation and turn this over to Emmy Wang at Green Lining Institute. I know we don't appear to have had much success in terms of giving control over, but Emmy, why don't you see if you do have control and take it from here.
Great, thanks Chuck. I will try to see if I have control. It looks like I don't currently, but I can get started. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we're going back to the very beginning. Thanks everyone. My name is Emmy Wang with the Green Lining Institute. We are running a little bit behind time, so I do imagine that my portion, I'm going to try to kind of breeze through it as much as possible, but I imagine that we might go a couple minutes past 1 p.m. So if you're able to join us, please do. If not, the slides will be made available at the end, and you can reach out to me at any time with questions. I also apologize if there's background noise. The building across the street from us is during construction, and so I hope that everyone can hear me. But anyway, I'm here to talk about how to incorporate social equity strategies, goals, and outcomes into your project so that we're really directing benefits to the most impacted communities. We believe that resources like tree planting can and should be used to engage community members, deliver multiple benefits, and deliver economic benefits such as workforce development, and that this can be done through this grant in particular. This is definitely reflected in the California ReLeaf grant. So by incorporating social equity into your application, you're not only directing those those benefits to impacted communities, but also really crafting the most competitive application. So let's see, I'm trying to switch this. Here we go. So I'm going to breeze through this. This is just a little bit about green lining. We work to greenline communities. You can find more on our website. And I'm also going to be through the climate gap, which is essentially an understanding that climate change hits low income and communities of color first and worst. And therefore, a lot of what we do here in California is trying to reduce and meet that gap with policies. And so here we go at the Climate Policy 101, and really the policies that govern California's climate infrastructure and that target funding and resources to under-resourced and underinvested communities. So here I'll spend a little bit of time. Many of you are likely familiar with SB 535, which is the policy that governs this grant, and which Green Lining co-sponsored back in 2012. SB 535 essentially directs 25% of funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to projects that benefit disadvantaged communities, with a minimum of 10% therein going to projects located within and providing benefits to DACs. In addition to the funding targets, SB 535 is also a model for improving communities by requiring multiple benefits directed at DACs or disadvantaged communities that are meaningful, assured, and measurable. So we come to this California ReLeaf grant with an eye towards how these projects are meeting the goals of SB 535. So a little bit on the mechanics. How exactly are disadvantaged communities or DACs determined, and how does this impact your application? Well, under the direction of Cal EPA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment developed Cal Enviro Screen. Cal Enviro Screen is a screening methodology to identify communities that are disproportionately burdened by multiple sources of poverty and pollution, and then identifies those census tracts in California that fall within the top 25% to be DACs. For the purposes of this particular grant, this grant is governed under Cal Enviro Screen 2.0, so that's version 2.0. You can find that at the link here on the slide. And this is just important to remember as you're working on your application and kind of looking at what census tracts your community falls under, because we'll really be using Cal Enviro Screen 2.0 as opposed to Cal Enviro Screen 3.0 for this grant. Another thing that's important to note is that this California ReLeaf grant has gone beyond the 25% minimums of SB 535. Recognizing that our most impacted communities need the most resources, 75% of projects funded for this grant will be located in DACs. This means that projects where there are more than 51% of the trees are planted directly in DACs will be the most competitive, and 75% of the funds will go to those sorts of projects. At the same time, there is still also the remaining 25% that is open to statewide competition. So some tips for success. Now that we've gone through some of the policy basics, how can your project meet the social equity goals of SB 535? So first, I want to start off with community engagement, which is foundational to everything else. Through meaningful community engagement, we can address priority community needs in ways that provide significant environmental, public health, and economic benefits, while also avoiding unintended harms. An urban forestry project is a great opportunity to engage your neighbors and local community groups, and there must be a commitment for active participation from your neighbors, from your community members, for both the planning and the implementation of the project. This really asks that you engage your neighbors and do more than just create a couple outreach flyers. It really asks that you organize, you go door to door, and you engage your neighbors not as an afterthought, but really as integral to the very kind of planning and conception of your project. This is particularly important for something like urban forestry, where the maintenance and stewardship of these new trees will be really dependent on having folks there a year from now, 3 years from now, who are willing to take on this stewardship. And so it's important that the community be stewards of your project and see these trees through. A couple important things to note about this grant specifically. Chuck talked about the 25% match requirement being able to be met with volunteer support. We definitely encourage this. And that's part of kind of that community engagement piece. We also really encourage you to craft non-traditional partnerships. We're seeing that some of the most innovative projects really come from applications that build on community strengths and engage a wide cross-section of different kinds of groups coming together for a joint outcome. And having, untraditional partnerships between, schools, CBOs, maybe the local parks department, is really a real reflection that different sectors of a community all agree that a project is something that they want to see, and also helps to ensure the long-term success of the project. And then lastly, the last thing to note is that there is an educational component of the grant application, and so using educational strategies can certainly be included within your strategies for community engagement. So you'll see listed below, I have some points. Those are essentially taken directly from the application. You'll see that in both the guidelines and the scoring and the application questions, you'll be asked specifically about your community engagement strategies, and hopefully you'll have some good strategies in store. So moving on to multiple benefits. Another key component of the grant is that we're doing much more than just tree planting. We want you to also think about other benefits and impacts that can be carried out through the grant. Over the years, we've really incentivized and encouraged agencies to incentivize projects that deliver on multiple co-benefits. And this means that as an applicant, in order for your project to be successful, it really has to be hitting at these other angles beyond just planting trees. And we recognize that that's a slightly harder ask on you, but we hope that you see the importance of getting at multiple impacts in order to really drive cumulative benefits into your communities. So first off, your project must demonstrate a nexus between important community needs and the benefits that your project will provide. Some examples of co-benefits include improved air quality, stormwater management, energy conservation, urban heat island mitigation, enhanced walkability, workforce development, and economic benefits. So as you're crafting your project, in addition to thinking about the tree species and the tree size and the location of plantings, also ask how can your project enhance quality of life by providing shade, by providing public and recreational spaces that people want to hang out in, by helping to increase the air quality in the neighborhood. And so again, you'll see this reflected in the scoring and also in the application questions. And lastly, we really want to focus in on one co-benefit, which is economic benefits and workforce development. Through your grant application and your project and your employment and procurement practices, you really have an opportunity to contribute economically to your local community. Across the state here in California, the tree care industry is facing a real shortage of skilled tree care workers. And so our hope is that if you were able to incorporate workforce development into your project could really provide an introduction to the tree care sector as a source of good jobs. When we talk about workforce development, we mean activities such as tree planting projects with youth, internship training programs that offer stipends, and ongoing tree care activities that provide sustained paid work. So essentially, ask yourself how you could introduce your neighbors to trees and tree care, how you could offer internships and stipends over the course of the season. And then as you prepare the site, cut the concrete, and engage in long-term tree care maintenance, how can you provide, sustained paid work for members of your community? Additionally, on the California ReLeaf website, they've linked to a flyer on green jobs that provides more resources, including community college tree care programs, as well as tree care companies. So if you or your community members are kind of interested in learning more or finding, how do we make these connections, that flyer and that resource is available on the website. And then finally, more broadly speaking, beyond just workforce development, we definitely encourage you to think about economic benefits more broadly by maximizing contracting and procurement of goods from local businesses located within DACs, and minority and women-owned businesses. This essentially means that if there's any labor or contracting to be done, that those economic benefits stay within the community by hiring locally and contracting locally. So, community engagement, multiple benefits, and economic benefits. These are three facets that we really think can and should be maximized in your grant to direct kind of real, tangible benefits to your community. We want to see projects that hit that sweet spot of doing all these things. And you can see on the left-hand side, I've collected all the scoring points that talk about community engagement, co-benefits, or economic benefits. And it adds up to a good chunk, 36 points, if you're able to hit these three considerations. And so by engaging community members, delivering multiple benefits and economic benefits, you're able to really craft a competitive project, but more importantly, get at the underlying social equity goals of this grant program as dictated under SB 535. So with that, yeah, that's about it for me. Thanks. You're welcome to reach out to me at any time at mew@greenlining.org. And I think at this point, we'll open it up for questions, and I'll turn it back to Chuck.
Thanks so much, Emmy. Did a great job getting through that. I know we're running a couple minutes behind, so I'm just going to get to questions right away. Looks like there's only one more that's popped up. Can you describe the meaning of urban, as many disadvantaged communities are in rural areas? Is rural ineligible? Absolutely not. Urban, I believe our definition is an urban area or city has to be 2,500 or more residents, so the threshold for criteria is actually pretty low. You're absolutely correct that rural areas have plenty of disadvantaged areas. We have a lot of applicants, several projects in the Central Valley where there's certainly a lot of rural areas, same with the Inland Empire. So two things there is in terms of meeting the urban definition, it's population above 2,500 residents. I think we've only had one instance in the last decade where a project didn't qualify as urban because I think that population was like at 2,100. But otherwise, totally fair game. And in terms of, again, the disadvantage versus non-disadvantage, this application does have up to $200,000 for projects outside DACs. This is the first time we've been able to include it in this particular grant program. So the whole state is effectively eligible once you hit that 2,500 minimum in terms of residents and community. Okay, a question that has just come up. I will take now. This looks like it's directed to Kalaine. What about the calculations of shade benefits from planting trees at parking lots? Shaded parking lots, so less air conditioners need to be run, less emissions from car engines, reducing heat island effect, even if no car is parked, so contributing to cooling the surrounding area. Any thoughts on that, Kalaine?
Sure. Trees planted to shade parking lots are incredibly valuable. In fact, one of my particular favorite statistics is that we did a study, the Center for Urban Forest Research did a study in Sacramento that showed that essentially 16% of the air pollution emitted from cars comes from cars that aren't running. So your car sits in a parking lot, it gets really hot, and all kinds of toxic substances leak out of the the gaps in the valves and the fuel tanks and all of those things. Unfortunately, the direct connection to greenhouse gas benefits has not been demonstrated there. So I would encourage you to plant trees around parking lots wherever you can for the comfort of your constituents, for the air quality benefits that come along with them. And I would describe those narratively in my co-benefit section. But the only tenuous greenhouse gas benefit there is that reduction in the urban heat island effect. And to some extent, that's accounted for in other trees that get an energy benefit. So, and truthfully, you have to plant a whole lot of trees to really make a dent in the in that urban heat island effect. And these projects are just not going to qualify at that scale. So, unfortunately, that's not going to get you any extra greenhouse gas values, but it is going to get you some substantial co-benefit points.
Thanks, Colleen. And then a follow-up question regarding the population threshold. Yeah, a population threshold of 2,500 would be required. So an unincorporated community with just a population of 500 next to a state park, that is pretty rural. That would not qualify, and yeah, it just wouldn't meet that minimum threshold for urban. So thank you for the question. I believe that is our last question. We've gone about 10 minutes over. I apologize for that, although it doesn't appear to have detracted from our attendance at all. I really want to thank all of my panelists for sticking this out with me. Emmy Wang at Green Lighting Institute, Colleen Ravden at Urban Ecos, and Matt Hennigan with the state. Thank you all so much for your participation today. Again, this will be either available through a link on our website or maybe we'll YouTube it, but check back on our website at our grants page, and we'll provide information if you want to see some or all of this again. At this point, I'm going to stop recording. Thank everyone for their time, and again,